Hello, and welcome to World History 1102. This is the Friday lecture for week 8 on Africa. This will be discussing Africa before and after the slave trade era. In other words, we're going to go back into history prior to the slave trade era that began in the 1500s, and then we will look at Africa during the imperialist period after the slave trade era from the mid 1800s into the early 20th century. We're going to be looking at what is known as what historians and geographers refer to as sub-Saharan Africa. This is Africa below the Sahara Desert, distinctive from North Africa, which is really more part of the Mediterranean world during classical times and is part of the Islamic world in the Middle Ages. Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, is that area below the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert, the largest in the world, separates these two parts of Africa into two distinct regions, and we'll be taking a look at the sub-Saharan part of Africa in today's discussion. So what was sub-Saharan Africa like in the period prior to the rise of the slave trade around 1500 AD? Africa in the pre-modern era, before 1500, consisted of various forms of polities, various forms of political entities, and they ranged along a spectrum. At one end, you had more hierarchical societies, kingdoms with a centralized authority, a capital, various means for enforcing borders and extracting taxes, bureaucracies of various kinds to run these kingdoms, asserting control over a specific area with borders. These kind of kingdoms were widespread in Africa in pre-modern times, but they were islands throughout Africa, from Senegambia in the northwest to Congo in Central Africa to the Sudan and Sahel. And these included such places as Benin, Mali, Ghana, Congo, Zimbabwe, and the very unique Christian kingdom of Ethiopia in East Africa. But as noted, these kingdoms were almost like islands within Africa, and they existed in a sea of what we might call stateless societies. These were societies where there was no centralized authority, where there was no king or hierarchy, where there was no large-scale bureaucracy, no fixed borders, and much of Africa fell into this category. These various stateless societies, they sort of shared a common ethnicity, common myths and beliefs, a common language, but as I said, no centralized authority. Here, society was dispersed among villages with local authorities who ran the villages. There might be federations, small federations of villages in one given area. But these were basically, what historians and what sociologists and political science refer to as stateless societies. In other words, there's no grand state that encompasses them. Authority is very much at the local level. The villages exist under their own local authority of chiefs and elders. And this kind of society was not just unique to Africa. It existed in many parts of the world, in many parts, for example, of the Americas prior to conquest. It existed in India before the Mughal conquest of the early modern era. And they existed across the Middle East in the pre-Islamic era. Unlike kingdoms where there's an authority often inherited, in these stateless societies, the means of governance came through what we call age grade systems. That is age and then hyphen grade, G-R-A-D, grade systems. And these were very common in the stateless societies all over the world, but we're going to take a look at them particularly in Africa. For example, along the windward, what Europeans called the windward coast of what is today the modern countries of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast, you had these societies known as the Poro, P-O-R-O for boys, and the Sande Society for girls. And in these societies, so here, with these kinds of special societies, these were kind of age-based societies. Here, prepubescent and pubescent children, from the age of 12, 15, 16, 17, there was a maturity ritual in which these children would be sent off into the forest under the guidance of a few elders, where they spent months away from their families and villages. They were taught the ways of their people, oral traditions, practical matters like hunting and war making for men, various domestic farming and marketing skills for women. They would undergo painful and stamina building rituals where they would And through all of this, while they were isolated out in the rainforest or in the savannah, where they would be learning these skills, learning oral traditions, there they would bond with other people of their societies, and where natural leaders from that particular age group would rise to the top. And become the future leaders of society. In other words, these were not inherited kingdoms, passed on from father to son, as was the case, but would often be this sort of system in which young children or adolescent children would form these kind of social groupings that would eventually become the leadership of the society for the next generation. Their chiefs and local village rulers would emerge, after exercising, sort of natural leadership qualities. But it was also based on the idea that they would share consulting and rule sort of as a collective with other members of their age group who had bonded in these Sanday, in particular for the boys, Poro societies. No one had absolute authority. These were not hierarchical civilizations, where the king had absolute authority. These were much more where the authorities, the chiefs, had to rule through consensus. In other words, they had to convince others to go along, convince others in their age group. And of course, as they got older, these age groups would become the elders in the village and would run things that way as sort of these collectives with one or two people as the leadership, as the chiefs of the village. But all decisions kind of made by the chief had to be okayed by this collective of others who had gone through these social rituals, these society retreats into the rainforest when they had been young. Now, even though authority was at the local level, and most people, sort of identify with the village, and there might be sort of ethnic and cultural groupings across wider areas where various villages, would be in touch with each other because they shared a common culture, common language, and of course there was quite a bit of trade. And all of these kingdoms and stateless societies, again, did not exist in isolation from one another. There were extensive trade relations between villages and between regions. There was, of course, war sometimes between different regions and different villages, much of it local, but also long distance in terms of the trade. For in addition, unlike the Americas, Africa was connected to Eurasian societies. There were trade routes across the Sahara based on salt, gold, and slaves. There was a slave trade, an Arab slave trade, which people were brought out of Africa to the Arab world. And of course, there was the unifying factor as Islam spread across the northern parts of sub-Saharan. Indeed, there were a number of kingdoms in the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa, the kingdoms of the Sudan, which were ruled by Islamic rulers, who established Arabic learning centers in their capitals and major cities, such as Timbuktu and Djenné, and what is now the modern-day country of Mali. But for the most part, Islam was not particularly evangelistic in this region, at least at first. The leadership in these various trading kingdoms, the leaders and elites might belong to Islam, but they did not push it into the countryside where animist faiths continue to exist. And even today, still in Africa, there's a more moderate form of Islam that lives alongside and incorporates animist ideas from pre-Islamic Africa, alongside a much more purist form of Islam that also exists, but that was not developed until the later 1800s. New highly religious upstart caliphates are established that emphasize conversion and try to try to expand into those areas that have been plunged into chaos because of the slave trade. And that is why today this band of Africa, the Sahel region, the semi-desert region south of the Sahara, is heavily Islamic, because these Islamic societies in the early modern period filled in the gaps as older kingdoms and polities collapsed because of the slave trade. Meanwhile, in East Africa, another outside influence, adopted by Africans and turned into their own, existed in the Swahili city-states along the Indian Ocean, which primarily existed to trade African goods from the interior into the vast Arab and Indian-controlled trade routes. So there were a number of these small city-states up and down the east coast of Africa, where Arabs and Africans and even people from India sort of coexisted in these trading centers that were part of a larger Indian Ocean trading network. The other thing to note about Africa is it is, and this seems like obvious, but it is a very large place, something that often gets disguised on typical Mercator projections of maps shown on the right here. compared to the actual size of Africa, shown on a Peters projection, which you can see on the left. Africa is a very large place. In fact, it is the second largest continent in the world, and until recent times was rather underpopulated. There was always plenty of land to bring under cultivation. And so in many ways, and so what happened in Africa in pre-modern times was that land did not become the source of wealth in most African societies because there was always plenty of it. There was always plenty of places to expand into because there were large sort of open areas between villages. Because again, because of the immensity of Africa, the large areas that are, that get enough rain, and can be centers of agriculture. So land wasn't the source of wealth. What was the source of wealth in many African societies, and those stateless societies we spoke about, but also in kingdoms as well, people were the main source of wealth. And so, it was very common in many African societies to have, for well-off men, for men with certain degrees of power and authority and wealth, to have many wives and to have many children, because this was able to utilize larger numbers of labor, larger numbers of laborers, larger number of people into these large extended African families in order to work what land they did have. Because again, in Africa, people were really the source of power and wealth more than land and property was. And here you see the chart of a village society in Africa, where you have the council of elders at the top, the village chiefs formed a council of elders, you have the village chiefs, extended families, and so villages and societies in Africa were divided into these larger extended families. Sometimes for poorer families, these were based on more nuclear type families, but most families were extended. They include grandparents, uncles, cousins, and families, again, to utilize a larger labor force. It made things more efficient. It made things more productive. And of course, with wealthy people and more powerful men, they may have multiple wives in order to have more children and more labor at their command. Now, one of the other things to keep in mind about Africa, besides the fact that it has this immense size, it was generally underpopulated, the other thing to keep in mind about them is that environmentally speaking, Africa is a very harsh place to live in pre-modern times. In many places, particularly the thick rainforests, soil fertility is low. It sort of seems like it runs counter to common sense because you see all this vegetation, all this luxurious greenery. But in fact, the soil in much of Africa is quite depleted because most of the nutrients, most of the materials that would be in the soil to create fertility are actually captured in the greenery and in the trees. They're not in the soil itself because they've been sort of sucked out of the soil by the thick, dense rainforest. In addition, and I think as I mentioned in class last time, the other problem that Africans faced was that there were really no beasts of burden. There were no oxen, no horses, no sheep, no animals like that, because of various forms of various diseases that afflicted these animals, made it impossible to raise them in this part of Africa. And so that, combined with the low fertility of the soil, basically undermine the ability in many parts of Africa to create agricultural surpluses that are the basis for large states and large kingdoms. And that's why much of Africa much of Africa, though there were these isolated kingdoms here and there, much of Africa did not get consolidated into large hierarchical societies because the soil, the lack of large domesticated animals made it very difficult to produce the agricultural surpluses that large kingdoms and societies rely on to build cities and that sort of thing. So again, this is one of the explanations for why Africa was largely a stateless society in the pre-modern era. And of course, it was that lack of large kingdoms, large hierarchical civilizations that could defend themselves that opened up Africa to the slave trade, which we talked about in the last two lectures, and I don't really want to go into too much right now. But of course, as we've been talking about the last couple of classes, the slave trade did come to Africa in a major way. The transatlantic slave trade came to Africa in a major way in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s. And of course, as I mentioned, undermined Africa's ability to modernize and grow economically and grow demographically because so many of its productive members were stolen from the continent, and the slave trade itself created chaos and violence that undermined the ability to maintain trading networks and experience agricultural and economic growth. And this sort of slowed Africa's development in a period when much of the rest of the world was modernizing and was developing, particularly Europe in this period. And as we discussed, the wealth that the slave trade to some degree, and much more importantly, the wealth that slave labor that produced all those commercial crops in the Americas, that produced all that wealth that returned to Europe and was utilized to develop the finances for Europe to industrialize and then, of course, to launch its imperialist expansion to the rest of the world. A lot of that was financed by capital created by slave labor, as we mentioned before. But by the late 1700s, you begin to get a movement. You begin to get the growing stirrings of anti-slavery sentiment in Europe. Some of it inspired by Enlightenment thinking about the natural rights of man, that man is born to liberty, that man is given his, that man is naturally born free, that this is an unalienable right of mankind. And these sentiments begin to kind of filter down through European societies in the late 1700s. And so what begins to happen, the other element that contributes to rising anti-slavery sentiment in Europe in the late 1700s and early 1800s is the rise of the working class. As industry begins to develop in places like England and Belgium and northern France and so forth, you begin to get a growing working class who are natural sympathizers to exploited workers. I mean, they begin to sort of see their own conditions like that of slaves, and they begin to sort of develop anti-slavery sentiment. And what's interesting about this is it even develops in the major textile centers of England and northwestern Europe, where cheap cotton produced by slavery is the essence of their economic their jobs basically in these textile factories, and yet they still working class people become very, get motivated to become very anti-slavery during this period. But of course, in this period in European history and English history, workers don't have a lot of say in the political system, especially against big vested interests like those of the the planters in the Americas. But what begins to happen also at this time is a rising middle class. Many of them very much influenced by evangelical Christianity and are influenced by the idea that all people are equal before God. This evangelical Christianity turns many against slavery. And this middle class does have influence. Many of them, over the course of the first half of the 19th century, they begin to get the vote and they begin to express their political influence. And one of the things that they push for is to outlaw. It begins with the slave trade itself. They begin to agitate against this, what is increasingly seen in many middle class circles in England and Northern Europe as an affront to their evangelical beliefs in the equality of all people before God, and also some of the Enlightenment ideas that people are naturally born free. And there begins to be a growing push to end the slave trade, if not slavery itself. And of course, it's the resistance of slave traders is not as great as that of those who profit off slavery in the Americas, the planters, because the slave trade, even though it's lucrative for some people, is not a huge industry. It makes for some wealth, but as rising sentiment against it grows, ultimately the British government decides, and then later other European powers and the United States, pass laws to ban the international slave trade. Britain does it in 1807. England does it in 1808, and other European countries soon follow. It takes another generation, of course, before slavery itself is banned, because, of course, slavery and slave labor is much more critical to the economies of European powers. But even there, by the 1820s and 1830s, an industrializing Europe no longer sees slave-based wealth as that critical to the economy anymore. Industrialization, manufacturing is much more important to the economy, and as sentiment rises against slavery as a moral outrage and an evil and an anti-Christian kind of thing, the resistance of vested economic interests of the planters in the Americas begins to wane in comparison to the power of the manufacturing interests. And even though the manufacturing interests in Britain rely on cheap slave-grown cotton, they are sort of overwhelmed by this rising public sentiment. And you see the banning of slavery in much of the Western world in the first half of the 19th century. It's banned in Britain is the first, and well, the northern states of the United States are the first in the first half of in the 1800s, 1810s, 1820s. You see slavery banned throughout the northern states. In 1833, slavery is banned in the British Empire. In 1848, it is banned in the French Empire, although there was a brief banning of it during the French Revolution itself. And other European powers go along with it as well, and slavery pretty much dies out in the European colonies in the Americas, with the exception of the Spanish and Portuguese, by mid-century, by 1850. The United States, of course, where slavery was much more integral both to the economic system of the United States and to the political system, slavery, of course, hangs on and only is defeated in a massive civil war that sees the planter class who launched the Civil War to protect slavery completely defeated in this war and are ultimately forced to give up slavery by a victorious North. And of course, in some places in South America, slavery is not banned until the late 19th century. Brazil, as I mentioned before, is the last of Western country to end slavery, and it does not do so until 1888, although slavery was dying out in the decades leading up to that final emancipation in 1888. Now, one also has to remember, we talked about this in class briefly, is that through much of early modern African history, from the 1500s to the early 1800s, mid 1800s, when the slave trade was, at its peak, Europeans largely stayed out of Africa. They didn't settle in Africa in the same way that they settled in the Americas. And the reason for that, of course, is that Africa was not a very inviting place for Europeans. The disease environment in Africa and the climate of much of tropical Africa did not suit most Europeans. They did not have immunities to malaria and yellow fever, which are endemic to the region. And so very few settled there. And as I said before, it was those who were involved in the slave trade often referred to Africa as the white man's graveyard. There were some exceptions to this, of course, in the more temperate parts of Africa. There were settlements by Europeans, particularly in southern Africa, in South Africa, which has much more of a Mediterranean climate much like we have here in California, than the rest of Africa. And there you saw a large influx of settlers originally of Dutch origin, who became known as the Boers. And in those readings by British government officials and those readings of African kings to Queen Victoria that I had you read for this week's reading on Africa, you can see them appealing to the Queen to do something about these settlers. Ultimately, Britain gained authority over much of southern Africa when gold and diamonds were discovered. And they're appealing to Queen Victoria to do something about these aggressive Boer settlers who are moving into the lands of these kingdoms in southern Africa, these African kingdoms. But outside of southern Africa, Europeans largely stayed out of Africa, as I explained, through until really late in the 19th century, when several things came together to lead to a new interest in Africa and what historians refer to as the new imperialism in Africa. It begins, one part of it that leads to this new interest in Africa is economic, that there's a growing recognition in Europe that Africa itself can be made profitable. That is not profitable by extracting slaves from it, but that Africa itself can be utilized, and that the labor in Africa can be utilized in commercial ways that will serve European imperialist and economic interests. There's the growing development of commercial agriculture. The most important, there's two very important crops that Europeans develop in Africa. One is palm oil, which develops extensively in West Africa, and this, of course, is the dominant source of vegetable-based oils for lubricants and soap in the era before petroleum displaces them. Palm oil was the main source of lubricants for the machinery that became an important part of the Industrial Revolution, for soaps as well. And then, of course, in South Africa, as we mentioned before, the discovery of gold and diamonds in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s leads to a vast influx of gold seekers and miners from all around the world, and particularly from Europe, who flood into the region and displace the African societies that are there. Another impetus for European settlement comes from the same source of thinking that led to the banning of slavery. The banning of slavery, was inspired by Christian evangelism in large part in Europe, but it was also that European powers, influenced by this, decided that they were going to get involved in Africa to end what they considered endemic slave trading in Africa. They saw it as their mission to end this sort of thing, which is kind of ironic, of course, because it was the transatlantic slave trade that had expanded slave raids and warring over capturing slave in Africa that had been exacerbated by European influence from the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s. But by the late 1800s, European powers had decided, well, since we banned slavery and slave trade, we have this mission, again, inspired oftentimes by Christian missionaries, that we need to ban it in Africa itself. And so many Europeans, saw it as a mission to settle, to extend European influence into Africa to end what they considered to be this evil, even though, of course, they had been practicing it for hundreds of years. And with this crusade to end slavery also came this sort of idea that Europeans had a mission to civilize Africans and to Christianize Africans. This idea of the white man's burden, that it was the white man's burden to go in and uplift the non-white peoples of the world, and Africa became a locale for that impulse to be acted upon. And you started getting the extension of missionaries into Africa, and with them the backing of European states. There was this idea that grew in Europe in the late 19th century, that the rest of the world, was living in were living in barbarism, and that it was the duty of Europeans to end it. Even though, of course, when they entered Africa, they oftentimes on those palm oil plantations practiced highly exploitative forms of labor that resembled slavery and undermined the very notion that Europeans were there to uplift Africans, and in fact they were there oftentimes to exploit their labor, but this time in Africa, and not as extracting the labor and sending it to the New World in the transatlantic slave trade. Now today we look upon Europeans as incredibly hypocritical, that they claim they were there to civilize Africans, but of course installed themselves as the superiors in Africa, exploited African labor brutally on these palm oil plantations, and as we're going to see in the rubber trade, which we'll talk about in a moment. And we see this today as hypocrisy, but Europeans at the time saw themselves as fulfilling this grand mission, some of them inspired by Christian thinking, others inspired by the idea of white man's superiority and this idea that the white man had this mission to civilize the rest of the world. And finally, another thing that led to European intrusion into Africa in the late 19th century were technological breakthroughs. Most important of these were things like railroads, steamboats that allowed Europeans to be able to penetrate the interior of Africa more effectively, a new weaponry that gave Europeans much greater ability to control African people through the application of violence, organized violence in the form of military organizations, oftentimes officered by white Europeans but manned by African troops, armed with the latest European weapons, including automatic weapons that gave Europeans an incredible superiority to impose their will over the African people. And finally, new breakthroughs in medicine, particularly anti-malarial medicines like quinine, and also public health measures that allowed Europeans to more safely live in tropical regions. The leader of this new push into Africa was not a European state, but a European monarch. King Leopold II of Belgium, um, uh, in the 1870s, began to send out he was a very wealthy man, and he began to use his wealth to develop a large-scale rubber extraction industry in the Congo. In the late 19th century, rubber was becoming an increasingly valuable commodity. It was being used in all kinds of machinery. It was using in all kinds of places in rubberizing boots and in clothes to make things rainproof. It was being used in what was a growing phenomena around the world, the rise of bicycles, of all things, the rubber tires on bicycles. There was an increasing demand for that, and the very beginnings of the automobile industry and the rubber tires that it rode on, by the late 19th century, were increasing the demand for rubber. Now, eventually, rubber plantations would be developed all over the world, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and so forth. But in the early years, rubber was extracted from wild rubber plants, rubber trees that grew naturally in much of the Congo basin of Central Africa. And King Leopold II developed a system whereby he sent in heavily armed white troops who would then organize small armies of African soldiers who were under the command of these white officers who answered to King Leopold. And they developed basically what was seen as a kind of a terroristic system. They basically set up a quota system, and they would go around to various villages throughout the Congo and would demand these villages produce certain quantities of rubber, of latex, the natural sap from the rubber trees that would eventually that gets made into rubber. And these quotas were oftentimes extremely difficult for the villagers to meet, and so Leopold's forces would basically terrorize villages into producing their quota of. And one of the ways they did this was by using torture and violence to make sure that the villages produced their what was expected of them in terms of latex production, of latex gathering. And one of the methods was they basically, in villages where people had not extracted enough rubber, they would cut off the hands and other limbs of villagers where it was not raised enough. Ultimately, the King Leopold's vicious rubber extraction regime in the Congo led to a massive human rights crusade in Europe and America. In America, one of its leading figures was the author Mark Twain, and ultimately, King Leopold had his Congo state taken away from him by the Belgian government because the outrages he was committing there were so egregious that even Europeans could not stand for it, and eventually ended it. Here, for example, you see rubber workers bringing in buckets of latex, and of course as you see, the ultimate product made from the rubber that was extracted by these villagers throughout the Congo in this horrible, vicious regime in what was euphemistically called King Leopold's Free Congo State. But even though ultimately, and it took many years, of course, for that terroristic regime to be ended, by the removal of the Free Congo State from King Leopold's rule and its turnover to the Belgian government. The Belgian government sort of ended that practice of terror in the villages, but then imposed itself as the imperialist ruler of the Congo. But the other thing that King Leopold's move into Africa did was it set off what historians refer to as the scramble for Africa. Various European powers began to realize that there was wealth to be had in Africa, that new technologies and new medicine allowed for European penetration into Africa, and there was this new push for European empires to enter into Africa. Now, what that did was it set off a competition among the great powers of Europe, Britain and France to begin with, and then, of course, the new state of Germany, which rose up in 1870, which became a new power in Europe, also sought empire in Africa. And all of these states wanted to get into the imperialist game. France, which had largely lost its earlier empire to Britain, wanted a new empire, not just in Africa, but Southeast Asia as well. Germany wanted its imperial, it felt as a rising power that it deserved an empire. And of course, there were the older empires of Portugal that Portugal already had in Africa. And of course, Britain did not, with fearing it left out, also decide to move in. And each believes that, contrary to the reality of things, that owning an empire is crucial economically. In fact, many of these colonies did not pay for themselves, but it became a matter of prestige and diplomatic bargaining that they felt that they had to have these African territories to show off their power and to show off their prestige. And so, as the Europeans moved in, there was a growing fear among European leaders that this might lead to inter-European war as each fought for different territories in Africa. Ultimately, it was decided that there had to be a more diplomatic way to divide up Africa to avoid potential conflict. And so, in the winter of 1884-85, the great powers of Europe all met in Berlin under the aegis of Otto von Bismarck, the leader of this new German state. And basically, they all sort of got together and they divided up Africa amongst themselves in order to avoid a war with each other. And they drew up lines based on their own interests. And of course, these lines had nothing to do with existing African ethnic divisions and geographical features. They were just arbitrary lines that divided Africa among different colonies that the different European powers had. And of course, those completely arbitrary borders continue to exist even after African colonies achieved their independence after World War II. But what is notable about, of course, the Berlin Conference that divided up Africa is no Africans were invited to it at all. The Europeans simply divided up Africa amongst themselves and began to try to exploit Africa commercially, and also to extend their, what they consider to be their imperial prestige and power in Africa. They tried to justify and rationalize this sort of expansion to Africa, this capture of virtually all of Africa. By 1900, all of Africa was under European rule, with the exception, all of sub-Saharan Africa was under European rule, with the exception of only two places: the independent Ethiopian kingdom in the highlands of Ethiopia, that was sort of out of the reach of European imperialists, and also was under the control of a more centralized state there under a king. And then, of course, the very small West African state of Liberia, an independent republic that had been established by by American slaves who were freed, and free blacks from America who were freed, and set up their own small republic in West Africa. But other than these two places, all of sub-Saharan Africa came under European rule. And to justify this rule, what Europeans claimed is they claimed that they were civilizing Africa. They were bringing schools and infrastructure to Africa that hadn't existed before. They were bringing Christianity and civilization. As I said before, they call it the white man's burden. And they did, in fact, bring some of these things to Africa. They built railroads. They established some schools in Africa. But for the most part, everything that they created in Africa is to serve their own interests. For example, the railroads that they built were basically railroads that went into the interior to where there were natural resources that they wanted to exploit, whether it be rubber or mineral resources or timber resources, and then they'd go down to some port where they could be shipped out by European merchants to Europe and to other parts of the world, and to make economic gains for European traders and for the European empires that these traders lived in and paid taxes to. The schools that they developed were largely, designed to train an African civil servants to serve the imperialist interests, to sort of administer these empires so that the Europeans could administer them more cheaply by using cheap African labor. And so while they developed a certain amount of infrastructure and schools and so forth, it was all designed, of course, to serve European interests. They also, of course, insisted on making Africa pay for itself. So they extended taxes across Africa. In many of these colonies, they instituted what was known as a hut tax. In other words, every householder had to pay a certain amount of tax to the colonial powers, and of course, this tax had to be paid in currency, in money, in coin, which was quite rare in Africa, and most heads of households did not have the resources to pay these taxes. And so what Europeans demanded instead was that if you couldn't pay the taxes, you had to donate some of your labor. And so they basically instituted forced labor to pay these taxes, and Africans were forced to either work on those palm oil plantations, on developing rubber plantations, in the mines, developing roads that would serve European interests, helping build railroads that would serve European interests. So in other words, Europeans taxed Africans in order to pay for the colonial regimes that ruled over and exploited them. So ultimately, Africans achieved almost nothing from the imperialism that was imposed upon them by the Europeans from the late 19th century, from the 1880s through World War II, until the final, the national liberation movements and the national liberation of Africa beginning in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a topic we'll be talking about later on in the course. And so, even with the demise of slavery, the slave trade by the early 1800s, the rise of the new imperialism and the scramble for Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries ushered in a new age of exploitation of Africa by Europeans. And again, but what's interesting to note, and we'll close with this thought, is that those same schools that were created by Europeans to educate Africans in order for them to serve as administrators of the empire that ruled over them. One of the things about what happened in many of these schools is that, it's you can't just teach, administrative techniques to people. You also have Africans were also introduced to some of these educated Africans were educated in ideas about democracy and about old Enlightenment ideas of natural liberty and people's right to be free. And so in these schools, which were designed to educate a class of civil servants who would rule over Africa on behalf of Europeans, many of these people were introduced, many of these young students were introduced to ideas that ultimately would lead them to challenge European rule. And so what's interesting to note is that many of the nationalist leaders that would help lead their peoples to independence in the 1950s and 60s from European rule, many of them were educated in these schools that were originally designed to train them to maintain the empire for Europeans. But that's something we'll talk about later in the course. So I thank you for listening to this discussion of of both Africa before the slave trade and the imperialist era in African history. Next week we will be turning to South Asia and India and the age of imperialism in that part of the world. And now please stick around, and we will be showing you, there will be a quiz for you to answer based on today's online lecture. So thanks for listening. We'll see you all on Monday, we hope. Please stay tuned. Check the Cal Poly website, check your emails and Blackboard for any notices about whether we're going to have in-person classes next week or we will go online due to the coronavirus. So thank you and stay well, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.